Hey guys, welcome back. Just pulling Project Berocca apart once again. Because in this video I'm giving the body a rattle can respray. Alright, now I've knocked up a holding stick for the body, just a piece of scrap pine. I've rounded the corners off so it's a bit easier to hold. I've spaced it up and away from the neck pocket just so I don't get a build-up of finish on the back here. And I've also organised a place just over in the corner there, out of the way, where I can hang the body between coats. For the paint itself, I'm actually kind of keen to try some hardware store type spray cans. In the past, when I've done this sort of thing, a solid colour on top of an existing factory finish, I've always used auto parts store spray cans or automotive acrylic touch-up paints, and that's because they're more suitable for wet sanding, buffing and so on. And in the past, the old spray cans that you bought at hardware stores were alkyd enamels, and they don't really do that very well. But things have changed. All of these brands are available in Australia: Rust-Oleum 2x, Duramax, British Paints Spray Easy, and there's another one made by PPG called Squirts. All of these, to the best of my knowledge, are non-alkyd, fast-drying, hard-wearing, self-priming spray cans. And so the modern spray cans kind of act a lot more like things like Duplicolor and all of that you buy at auto parts stores. So I'm going to try a couple of these products that I've never used on guitar bodies before. I have used all of these though on DIY projects and so on over the years, and I've been kind of pleasantly surprised at how well they do actually bond to difficult substrates like plastic, for instance, without a primer. In the past, you would always use a plastic primer with old school spray cans. I've used some of these on bare aluminium, project boxes and stuff. And again, in the past, you would always use an etch primer, but this paint seems to stick really well and bond to the bare aluminium quite well. So, having said that, I've never done a true adhesion test with any of these. And the other thing is that this body is very typical of factory finished solid body guitars of the last, I guess, 20-25 years, in that it certainly appears to be a two-pack automotive, industrial automotive type finish. It's as hard as nails. It seems to be very chemically resistant. This is close to 15 years old and there's barely a mark on it. So I'm going to do an adhesion test with this guy. I've chosen this one to use on Project Berocca for several reasons. Well, I already own this spray can. It's been kicking around for a little while, and it's also the color is it's called fishpond, and it's kind of reminiscent of Daphne blue or I think Lake Placid blue, the old Fender colors, but it's a little bit more vibrant, a little bit more modern, I guess. And I think it'll suit this body. It's got a Fender Jazz offset waist sort of design and a slightly retro look with the little white pickguard there. So I think it's going to look great. But I want to do an adhesion test, and it's something I haven't done for many years. And that's because, I guess in broad terms, when new paint is going onto old paint, there's, I guess, two ways that you get adhesion. And one is what they often call mechanical adhesion, and that's where you sort of scratch up or scuff the surface with sandpaper or Scotch-Brite, and the new paint kind of sort of flows into all those little micro scratches that you created, and when the paint dries, that's how it grabs onto the old finish. The other way that two layers of paint, new and old, bond is with what's known as cross-linking, and that's where the chemistry of the new paint, the solvents and so on, sort of slightly melt the old paint, and then the two layers mingle and then they cure together as one layer. Usually when you're respraying something, whether you're using primer or not, you're kind of hoping for a bit of both, but to try and get an idea of just how much mechanical adhesion we'll get and cross-linking we'll get, I think for my test patch, I'm going to spray a little test patch out on the back of this body. I think I've decided to just sort of scuff half of it, and just for my own amusement really, and just see how much this actually bonds without that mechanical adhesion. because this is, like I say, very hard and very glossy, this finish. That way I'll have two different surface treatments, scuffed and shiny, to test. So here's my test patch from the other day. Whenever you're using spray cans in general, you should always read the labels. They all vary on the recoat times, and the chemistry in them all sort of varies as well. This guy says that you can recoat anytime after 10 minutes, and I did 2 coats on this, about 25 minutes apart. And then this also says, because this dries so quickly, that it's ready for use after just an hour. And well, after an hour it was certainly hard enough to handle, but it wasn't fully cured at that stage. You can kind of tell just by feeling it with your thumb. It felt slightly rubbery, and also it smelt slightly of solvents as well. But certainly by the next day, it was as hard as it's going to get, and it doesn't have any of that sort of smell and everything. I scuffed that side of the test patch with 400 grit dry paper, and even after 2 coats, there's still a few swirls in it. So I think when I do scuff the whole body, I'll use, say, 600 grit wet paper instead, to give me a smoother surface. I've also sprayed out this little test patch, but I'll talk about that later on. In industry, when they do this sort of thing, they normally use a kind of like a special tool with a row of sharp cutters, and they just sort of drag it through the paintwork. But for DIY quasi-science like we're doing now, a fresh Stanley blade and a straight edge is absolutely fine. So now I've created a little crosshatch grid sort of pattern. The idea is to put some tape on, really rub that in as best you can. Again, in the industry they use a specific tape with a specific adhesive, but this is just packing tape because it's really all I have. So again, I'm just rubbing that in as hard as I can onto that crosshatch area, and I'm going to leave that for 10 minutes. Okay, I guess this is the moment of truth. Let's try the shiny side first. Well, that's actually pretty impressive. I'm now rubbing it with my thumbnail, and I actually can't get it to lift. So that's promising. And well, that's even cleaner. These score marks are all sort of feathered and chipped out on the shiny side, but on the scuff side they're very, very clean. Let's try something harder than a thumbnail. I'm going to try this plastic scraper. It's from one of these caulking tools. I am putting pretty much all my weight on that. Now let's try this side. I've got to say, you know, Duramax aren't a sponsor or anything, but that's pretty impressive. Yeah, that's actually pretty impressive. Okay, I've just found this other tape. This is that sort of thin white double-sided tape, and I can tell you now it has a much higher tack than just plain old packing tape, so I'm going to try that as well. So that's been about 20 minutes. I went and had a cup of tea. Let's try this much stronger tape. Oh yeah, there's a couple of chips now. And this is looking as clean as ever on this side. Now, for whatever reason, I've had a good look around, but I've had no luck finding 2-pack clear gloss spray cans. You used to be able to buy them. They had a often had a tool that you put in underneath and twisted, or just like a button that you pushed, and that would release the catalyst inside the can, and then you would probably get 8 or 12 hours or something to use up the can. And then what you got in the spray can was, well, you got 2-pack or 2K clear gloss, and by that you got a fairly high build finish, something that's very glossy, something that's very hard wearing and scratch resistant, and also chemically resistant to a certain extent as well. So the closest thing I've found is this guy. It's called Concept Paints Super Gloss Clear. These guys aren't a sponsor of the show, don't worry, but they're up in New South Wales, I think, somewhere near Sydney, and they mostly make products for the panel beating trade, coating systems, tinning systems, but they do make a few DIY products, and I just bought this at Autobarn. The thing that caught my eye was that it says here 2K technology, and it's obviously just a single part spray can. So hopefully that means that this guy has some of those properties I was just talking about. The main reason I sprayed this out is partly because I want to have a go at wet sanding and buffing, well, this as well as the Duramax on its own, just to get a feel for how they respond to that kind of treatment. But the main reason I sprayed this out was just to make sure that these two products are compatible. When you mix and match spray cans, it's a really good idea to do this sort of thing, because they all vary in drying times and the chemistry and everything that's in there. So you really do have to test them out, because if for whatever reason, say the base coat or colour coat is still curing out and you put a very fast drying clear coat on top, you can get sort of a wrinkling of the finish or some other kind of fry up that ruins your project and ruins your day. So this has certainly passed that test. I put 3 coats of the blue, and then I waited about an hour and a half and put 3 coats of clear gloss over the top. The flash time that these guys recommend between coats is 5 or 10 minutes, and it's been about 2 or 3 days now, and it certainly feels very hard with my thumbnail, and I can't smell any of the solvents still off gassing, so I assume that's pretty much fully cured. So I want to get on and wet sand and buff this. So I've got some 1500 grit sandpaper. I'm just going to wrap it around a neoprene block, and the idea here is just to kiss the tops, really. I'm not trying to remove a whole lot of finish. I'm just trying to kiss the top of these, any of the high spots, especially on this side where there's a few swirl marks from the initial sanding. I'm really not using any pressure at all. I'm really just letting the paper cut the surface. This sort of thing can be a bit messy, and I wouldn't normally do it on this bench, but the lights are better here, and this matting is due for replacement anyway. Now, in this operation, the lights that you have in your workshop are really important, because you need to be able to move it around so you can see the dull spots and shiny spots. You really want it to be almost completely dull. A few shiny spots really don't matter that much, but you really want to knock down the high spots as best you can. So that looks fine. Let's move on to the clear coat. Well, already this feels a lot harder to sand. It is a much bumpier surface though, this, because it was just a piece of bare MDF, unsealed. You can see all those little tiny shiny dots there, all of the dips in the finish. Well, there's a few little shiny spots that remain, but for a test piece, that's really all I need to do. So I've got my little hand drill loaded up with a 3-inch or 75mm buffing mandrel. It's got Velcro on it. I bought this and a whole bunch of polishing pads in a kit for, I don't know, 10, 12 bucks online. I've also marked the particular compound I'm using on each of these because you can wash them and reuse them, and you wouldn't want to mix them up even after they've been washed. So that stands for fine cut. That's the first grit of polishing compound I'm going to use. I am going to secure this on a table with my heavy bag of lead shot. Yeah, well, hopefully the camera can catch that. It seems to be polishing up just fine, actually. Let's try the clear coat. Notice I'm using different rags for different compounds. That's another good idea. Well, this section with the clear gloss on it is very glossy. I mean, it looks almost like liquid. But I must say, where I've buffed out just the base coat, colour coat, it's actually pretty shiny. And I think if you were just going for that 1950s or 60s solid colour fender look, that's really all you need. Because I don't believe they put a lot of clear coat or any clear coat on most of their solid colours back then. And it looks fine. I'm just also going to just see if I can get some scratches in it with Scotch-Brite. This is nowhere near scientific. In industry they use proper sort of scrubbing machines, but and this isn't even proper Scotch-Brite. I think it's just a scourer from the kitchen. But I'm just going to give it sort of 5 good rubs with a bit of weight behind it. Let's just see this one. Well, this definitely felt quite a bit harder. There's a lot less, I guess, dragging on that. Well, they both scratched, but this one a little bit more. So, again, this is going to give me more durability, the clear gloss, as expected. But I think this is, honestly, you probably wouldn't get any less scratching with nitrocellulose. There's one more test I want to do, and just hit these with a few solvents that I've got in the workshop. So I'm just going to try denatured alcohol first, or what we call metho in Australia, and see if I can... Oh, okay, yeah. So this is not alcohol resistant by any stretch. It's basically come straight up. In fact, I'm almost through to the orange. So yeah. Very good product, but not alcohol resistant. Let's try this clear gloss and see if I can pick some of that up or make it tacky or whatever. Yeah, it's also, to be honest, it's also coming up. It's getting quite tacky and all the rest of it. So neither of these sort of alcohol resistant. If I put it onto the 2-pack, the original 2-pack, it really does nothing. So in fact, it's kind of cleaning it. So yeah, we're not quite there yet. I'll try some white spirit as well, just by way of comparison. This is, I think in America you guys call this mineral spirits. It's what you thin oil-based paints with. It's a petrochemical as opposed to an alcohol. Well, it's taking a bit longer, but it is also coming up with that. Let's try this on the clear coat. Yeah, and it doesn't touch the clear coat at all, which is not surprising really, because this is white spirit or mineral spirit is very similar to Prepsol or panel white, which is actually what they use as a wax and grease remover when they repaint cars. So yeah, that's still nice and glossy. So well, we have a little bit more chemical resistance in the clear coat, but it's not perfect. So I think I'm ready to get on, sand this all back and get it painted. So here I'm removing the test patch. I could have sanded it off, of course, but rubbing it with Metho was working fine. To fill the scoring marks, I used some thin CA glue, mooched it in, waited a few seconds, then just wiped the excess off. For minor chips and dings in a 2-pack finish like this, super glue actually works quite well as a filler, or you can also use Bondo, or Bog as we call it in my part of the world. After I'd sanded this with 220, then 320 grit dry paper, the score marks were all but gone, and the few that were still visible were nice and smooth when I ran my thumbnail over them. Just like the polishing pads, it's a good idea to mark the grit number on any pieces of sandpaper you cut. That sanding block is one I've had for years. It's been sealed with a few layers of poly, and I've glued a thin piece of leather to one side, which provides just a little bit of give. It's ideal for this sort of job. When you're wet sanding the front, it's important to wipe down regularly and not leave a ton of standing water laying around for too long. Otherwise, the timber around the various holes can swell and you'll sand them level, but when they dry out, the finish will shrink back down and you'll have all of these little dips. For sanding the edges and cutaways, that's my little neoprene sanding block again. So now the finish is completely scuffed and dull looking, I'll put the holding stick back on and I'll wipe it over again with white spirit. Then I'll get everything ready, my respirator, I'll shake my can for a couple of minutes. If it's colder than say 15°C, I'll put the can in a bucket of warm water for a few minutes. It'll actually spray with a bit more pressure that way. Then the very last thing I do right before spraying is gently wipe the body over with a tack cloth. They're really cheap, you can refold them and reuse them many times, and they'll remove all those tiny little bits of dust and stuff that you can't see that would otherwise cause little nits in the finish. When I spray a body like this, I usually start with the cutaways, then the sides, followed by the edges, then the back and front. When you spray the sides, you often get overspray that wraps around and settles on the body, so finishing each coat with the back and front means any overspray there is kind of melted in and covered. Unfortunately, Duramax can spray in a fairly tight round pattern, and it was a bit windy here, so I'm actually a bit closer to the body than normal, and the coverage is slightly wayward, to be honest. I much prefer rattle cans that spray in a fan pattern, and if I was using this product for the clear coat, I would replace the tip. I think Dulux actually sell fan tips separately in a little kit. Anyway, I got through it and got a couple of fairly even coats on there. I really just need this blue to stick to and cover the orange. The majority of the finish will be built up with layers of clear coat. This can does have a fan spray pattern, and I realise now that its tip is the same design as the Duramax tin, so next time I think I'll just use the same tip for both tins. This footage is the first clear coat, and it wasn't really spraying as well as on the test board. I'm guessing I didn't fully clear the nozzle properly, so I took it off and cleaned it with white spirit after each coat, and it sprayed just fine after that. If you get a run or a sag in the paint, you really have to stop what you're doing and hold the body flat. So always have a clamp or a vise ready for that. To minimise runs, I always used to spray a quick mist coat, then wait for say 30 seconds before hitting the now tacky surface with a full, closer wet coat. But with spray cans, they cool very quickly and lose their pressure, especially when they're getting low. Plus, spraying this way with a holding stick, I'm moving the body around constantly anyway, so no surface is really staying vertical for too long. So these days with guitar bodies, I more or less dropped that technique. If you do have the luxury of a spray booth, having a movable light behind you is important so you can see the wet paint laying up. But if you have to spray outside like this, having the sun behind you is, I guess, the next best thing. So I did 2 coats of fishpond, followed by 5 coats of super gloss. Then I hung the body for a few days. I started wet sanding it, but noticed that the finish was printing. By that I mean that the non-slip matting underneath was actually leaving fine marks on the finish. So even though it seemed fairly hard, the lacquer obviously wasn't fully cured. So I hung it up for another week or so. Then I wet sanded it with 1500 grit, followed by 2000 grit. It's a good idea to soak the paper overnight. That's a little trick that a panel beater mate told me a few years ago. I'm not really sure what it actually does, but the paper definitely seems to cut cleaner and last a bit longer. Again, when you're wet sanding or buffing, you really want to avoid using excessive downward pressure. If the paper or compound you're on is taking too long, then you want to step back to the next coarser abrasive and then work up from there. If you force these fine abrasives, honestly, you'll just be creating bigger scratches than the ones you're trying to remove. I always have a sheet or two of every grit on hand. Top tip, concertina file is a really great way to organise and store your sandpaper. Honestly, there's tons of ways to buff out a finish and hundreds of different papers and compounds. Wet sanding followed by a couple of these Meguiar's compounds has worked really well for me over the years. But I think if I was doing this more often these days, I'd certainly be experimenting with some of the more modern abrasives that are out there, like micromesh, for example. Although that stuff it's not cheap in my part of the world, I have to say. While I think of it, Meguiar's don't make these 2 products anymore. So I did contact them and they recommended Ultra Cut M105 instead of the old number 2 and M205 Ultra Finishing Polish as a sub for my near empty bottle of number 9. For polishing cutaways, I use these things. I call them lollipops. They're very cheap and easy to put together. Check out my quick tech video on how to make them. So here she is. I think the colour really suits her. Honestly, the finish is not 100% perfect. There are 1 or 2 tiny blemishes in there, and that does bug me. But if you're spraying outside in the breeze, you really do have to temper your expectations slightly. And you also can't expect a rattle can to atomize lacquer quite as nicely as a spray gun. So there's always going to be a bit of orange peel to deal with. But I hope I've shown you that with a bit of practice, you can get very close to a pro finish with DIY type rattle cans. And by doing a few simple tests, you can actually get creative with the products you choose and use products that are local to your part of the world instead of just following the well-trodden path. And also use them with confidence that they're going to work really well for a project like this. I should say that I retested the clear coat on my spray out, and with full cure time, this stuff actually does resist denatured alcohol. So thanks for watching. Please subscribe and hit the bell icon, and I'll see you in the next one.